Although there are a number of examples of activist approaches to music education, one person in particular has been championing this perspective internationally over the past years. It is therefore natural to turn to Juliette Hess, and in particular her 2019 book Music Education for Social Change, Constructing an Activist Music Education, when discussing this topic. Hess takes an open approach to the concept of activism, but still refers to Aaron Kantz's 2015 definition as a starting point. Kantz explains, quote, "In a general sense, to engage in activism is to in some way work for social change. As such, activism requires an imaginative or creative element, the ability to understand ourselves as other than we are. More specifically, activism involves the determined interventions into the normative processes and practices that govern the world in which we live. As a practice of intervention, activism necessarily remains grounded in the realm of the material. Activist practices are material practices. Through activism, one might seek to generate new meanings, new ways of considering and engaging with the world." Unquote. In order to find sources of inspiration and role models for activist music education, Hess turns to a diverse group of people she calls activist musicians. In this context, however, I would like to focus more directly on music education researchers and their preconditions, possibilities, and, in this particular setting, limitations and considerations for engaging in what I've referred to as academic activism. Academic activism may be described as the engagement of scholars and educators in activities that promote justice, equity, and systemic change within and beyond academic institutions. This form of activism involves using research and the dissemination of research to address societal issues and to advocate for marginalized voices, groups, and communities. Integrating social theory and social justice issues into academic curricula and encouraging students to engage critically with these issues would be integral components of an activist pedagogy. But academic public engagement also means extending academic work beyond the classroom to engage with communities, policymakers, and the public. This may involve writing opinion pieces, participating in public forums, and working with community organizations. It is therefore reasonable to think that academic activism would include participation in movements for social change, using academic influence to support causes such as social and racial justice, gender equality, cultural diversity, environmental sustainability, to name a few immediate associations, which I believe can also be found in examples of recent music education research with more or less pronounced activist ambitions. However, there are some aspects of the position and role of academics that require closer and not least critical reflection. In particular, I would like to draw attention to issues of representation, reflexivity, and reaction, but in conclusion I will also touch on possible responses to these issues. My first reflection is on what music educators and scholars should consider when taking on the role of activist or spokesperson for voices and groups whose music values and perspectives are subject to marginalization, injustice, or oppression. The overarching issue here seems to be the fundamental problem of representation. Who can speak for whom? In her seminal 1988 essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak criticized prominent scholars like Gilles Deleuze and Michel Foucault for conflating two meanings of representation. That is, on the one hand, representation as speaking for, as in politics, and, on the other hand, representation as representing, as in art or philosophy. In this way, Western white male philosophers seem to represent the voices of people subjected to inequality, oppression, violence, and related conditions, as if they themselves were absent non-representers. Thus, Spivak's argument is that while these intellectuals present themselves as transparent, they actually represent the oppressed subjects from what we must assume is an unconscious perspective that implicitly contributes to their othering, in part by consistently referring to the other as more homogeneous than the intellectual's own group. The insight that when one acts as a representative of something, one is simultaneously representing or interpreting it from a certain position, entails an awareness that every statement, every attitude, consciously or unconsciously, conveys a positional normative interpretation. This may be particularly challenging in relation to the supposedly tolerant and inclusive self-image of academic activists. However, the lesson to be learned from Spivak is that it is not possible to understand the representation of someone or something without considering how it is represented. Nor is it possible to think of representation without acting as a representative of some kind of interest. Spivak therefore calls for a form of reflexivity that critically confronts intellectuals with their positions of power and particular interests in self-representation. In other words, as academics, educators, and researchers, we should seek to engage thoroughly with our own position in order to remove the cloak of invisibility and thereby make visible some of our habitus and culturally capitalized power, according to Spivak. When considering reflexivity, I am returning to Juliette Hess, who has warned about several dangers in her aforementioned book. They all seem relevant, but I'm going to go with one of her standalone articles where she specifically points out the danger of autocracy as a potential result of activism. She begins by quoting activist musician Pete Shungo, who says, quote, "Even teachers who are really progressive or really left-leaning can unintentionally not give students much freedom, because they want students to believe exactly the same thing that they do. Regardless of the political leanings of the teacher, it's important for them to teach students not to just trust someone because they're a teacher, not to just trust someone because they're older than them, that it's important to be able to question." Unquote. So, Hess asks whether activist music education might ultimately foster a new autocracy. This is an important question, and I highly recommend her article, not least because it draws on interesting perspectives from Deleuze and Guattari, but I would still like to ask whether it might be even more rewarding to look beyond individual music teaching practices and ask who the academic activists are as a group and how they position themselves in relation to other groups in the social hierarchy, as well as what political inclinations and potential power they might have at a systemic level. First of all, it should be noted that, according to a Bourdieu-inspired class analysis, highly educated academics, as well as musicians and artists, belong to those fractions of the upper middle class and elite that are characterized by a status linked to the amount of cultural capital they possess. In terms of political orientation, it is of course true that academic activism can and does have both a left and a right orientation. However, it is interesting to observe how academics and other groups with a high cultural capital have moved politically from right to left in their voting habits in all Western democracies in the post-war period, according to analysis by Thomas Piketty and colleagues. This includes a shift towards liberal ideals of openness and tolerance among these groups, which means that they will often support values such as cultural diversity, immigration, and globalization, while at the same time not having the same material interest in economic redistribution as the lower classes, who incidentally suffer far more from the negative consequences of this social development than the privileged cultural and educational elite. If not in their own eyes, then at least in the eyes of others, this can give academic activism a significant credibility problem with regard to more vulnerable socio-economic groups, especially if the activism is accompanied by a hint of moral superiority. In any case, it needs to be said that, taken together, class and political affiliation make academics a far more homogeneous group than the rest of the population they are supposed to be serving, which may be worth remembering. Now, I don't want to be more cynical than necessary, but in this context I cannot avoid mentioning that I have occasionally expressed the view that academic activism is a double game, where sincere idealism has to be balanced against considerations of, for example, imposed and expected career building with the help of the additional cultural or academic capital that can be harvested from the game. This brings me to the next issue, which is reaction, or how academic activism is perceived. Any thesaurus seems to list crusader as a synonym for activist. This suggests that this concept is also perceived and interpreted within the framework of duality. To those involved, activism has the character of a noble and moral act, while to outsiders it can appear sanctimonious and unempathetic. This is particularly true when those perceived to represent liberal and left-leaning urban elites criticize attitudes and practices embedded in conservative rural communities, which have increasingly become the basis for right-wing populist and radical movements and parties. Nevertheless, such interventions have often been the target of activist campaigns. In this context, I find it instructive to take a closer look at sociologist Ali Russell Hochschild's studies of the mutual distrust between liberal and conservative social groups and regions in probably the most polarized Western society today, the United States. Hochschild has conducted long-term ethnographic studies in deeply conservative Louisiana and Kentucky to understand why many working-class whites on the political right feel alienated and support policies that often seem contrary to their economic interests. Against this background, she introduces the concept of the deep story, outlined as a narrative that captures the emotional core of people's experiences. For many conservative poor people, this deep story involves queuing up for the American dream only to see other groups seemingly cut ahead with the help of the government. This narrative fuels feelings of resentment and betrayal. Many people also express a loss of cultural identity and a fear of losing their way of life. Hochschild highlights how these emotions are central to shaping their political beliefs and actions. When their emotions and beliefs are attacked by what is perceived as a condescending and arrogant elite, wounded pride leads on the one hand to righteous anger, in whose name Donald Trump appears as the good bully strong enough to fight back. On the other hand, these people are subjected to a shame that is clearly expressed in a quote from an interviewee that appears in Hochschild's latest book, Stolen Pride. He says, quote, "If you're white and poor, people think, what's wrong with you that you're stuck at the bottom? If I just look at my own life, I came from nothing and I got to nothing, and I'm not a victim of racism because I'm white. So to most Americans, I'm less than nothing. If it's such a privilege to be born a white male, what could explain me except my own personal failure?" Unquote. By telling these voters instead to be proud of themselves and to blame others, such as liberals, immigrants, or the federal government, for their failures, Trumpism, Hochschild argues, offers them a way out of this kind of shame. Left-wing politicians, activists, and academics have not been able to meet these groups at home to the same extent. And so, the antagonistic contradictions are taking yet another turn for the worse. But how can academic activists respond to these challenges? On the premise that it should be done democratically, activist action must ultimately win a majority. This means that it has to deal with both its supporters and its opponents. Against an antagonistic mindset and its tendency to dehumanize opponents by attributing to them morally undesirable qualities and bad intentions, Chantal Mouffe recognizes conflict as a constructive part of politics when it takes place within a democratic framework. She thus advocates agonism as a way of approaching opponents with recognition and respect. This involves accepting that conflicts are real, but that they exist under conditions regulated by a set of democratic procedures accepted by both parties. In a democratic society, different interests and demands should be considered legitimate, even when they conflict and consensus cannot be reached. Hochschild's research provides a broader context for understanding the political climate, particularly the rise of the Tea Party and later support for Donald Trump. She examines how cultural, historical, and social factors contribute to the political leanings of the people she interviewed. Through her research, Hochschild aims to bridge the gap between left and right by fostering empathy and understanding. She emphasizes the importance of acknowledging and addressing the emotional experiences that underpin political beliefs and argues for a more compassionate and informed dialogue across the political spectrum. Hochschild therefore speaks of empathy walls, the barriers that prevent people from understanding those with different backgrounds and beliefs. By trying to overcome these walls, she aims to promote empathy and mutual understanding between liberals and conservatives. Bourdieuian social theory, on the other hand, tends to see the functions of art, music, and culture in terms of the social reproduction of a society based on inequality, exploitation, and oppression. For example, the good taste of the cultural elite is expressed first and foremost in contempt for the bad taste of others. This in itself could be an argument for the need for systemic social change. So perhaps Mouffe's agonistics is a prerequisite for this, along with Spivak's call for intellectuals to look at their own position and power from the outside. In today's world, unfortunately, it won't be easy anyway.